The largest WPA project in Johnson County, Kansas was Gardner Lake. The Gardner Lake Beach House was constructed in 1938 near the swimming area. Designed in a rustic style, the structure was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. The building was sold in 1990 and converted into a private residence.
Originally, it was started about 1919, this park. It didn't really have the name Coronado then, but with the finding of Spanish chainmail about 10 miles east of here, they got the story that probably Coronado came here and turned around and on his journey and trying to find the cities of gold in 1541, but no proof that he really absolutely came here, but the name Coronado Heights stuck from that time on. The Historical Society operated it and had a wooden building up here behind us, and with the bad times of the 30s, the Depression, it became difficult for them to maintain it, and they worked out an arrangement with some people in Salina to put it with the WPA Works Authority, and they used these buildings, and they built them in 1936 to and built the road at that time, and as a source of work for people who were out of jobs in those hard times in the 30s. And the structure style, I think, is kind of a national park rustic style. I think if you go to a lot of old national parks with buildings, you'll see the buildings are usually natural stone and made to kind of blend in a type of structures. And I think that's what they adapted and developed here. They designed it to probably look like an old fort or castle. Some people actually think that it's from back in the 1700s or something. Lots of people enjoyed coming up here to, well, it's a great parking place to meet, and I know several couples got engaged up here, and it's a great place to sit and look at the sunset and the sunrise. We were one of the 8 wonders of geography recently by the Kansas Sampler Foundation. I meet people here from all over the world I've met up here, but mostly come from Hutchinson, McPherson, and of course Lindsborg, and then Salina. Our biggest thing is vandalism, and people like to take axes to the concrete tables and knock off the edges. They try to set fire in here to the beams, and if we have any signs, they usually are shot up or painted with paint guns, so that we really don't just have left it primitive and not without any signs or too many things that people can damage, but we constantly have some vandalism, but people still appreciate it and are willing to come up here and volunteer to help us with cleaning and other work. There was about close to 15 these picnic sites, and they're scattered around the periphery. You can see the tops of the chimneys, and there's about 11 left, and they go around the whole periphery. It's steeper on some areas, and they've eroded and have more trouble with those. These on the southwest here are pretty good condition, and they go all the way around to this east side. There's 11 campsites, and then the one big central one. But there's probably constant erosion going on here. We're 300 feet above the river bottom down here below the valley, and I imagine it's slowly over time will erode down. I wonder why it didn't erode down from the beginning, but this was all underwater, a sea, and this is the Dakota sandstone on top, and evidently this rock is harder than what was down below us, and when the river came through here, it eroded that down 300 feet, but this stayed and left these buttes that you can see along here.
Washington High School is one of the few schools listed on the National Historic Register. The 3-story brick building features Art Deco style stonework and detailing. The native stone stadium was built in 1938.
In Oklahoma, there were more schools built than in any other state in the Union. Over 1,000 schools, 1,010 I think is the specific number. That helped Oklahoma probably more than any other construction project that the WPA hosted. It gave children an opportunity to go to school. Once schools were built during the New Deal, the WPA years, attendance in schools in Oklahoma mushroomed. And during the construction of many of those schools, people just were so thankful that children are being tended to. It's okay to put daddies and mamas to work through the WPA, but now that those parents and others have built that school, now the next generation can actually receive an education and prepare themselves for a future and maybe to avoid economic disaster in the future. So that was a godsend.
Following a fire that destroyed the school, Wyandotte High School in Kansas City, Kansas was built in 1937 at a cost of $2.5 million. In addition to parks and playgrounds, airports, stadiums, athletic fields, golf courses, and zoos were constructed and became an important part of the WPA's revitalization of the country. Renovations and updates have kept these public facilities still in use today.
This is part of the old original Sunset Zoo, and it was a WPA project that was built back in the early 30s. When this exhibit was built back in the early 30s, it was originally 5 distinct exhibits, all just, put together. And they had a lion in one piece of it, and a bear in another, and a tiger in another, and very small little enclosures, concrete floors. The animal, the emphasis was just on showing the animals, and there really wasn't a lot of concern about their welfare or the kind of exhibits they were being kept in. This exhibit was renovated in the early 90s, and one of the things we did was we basically removed all the interior caging that was in here and opened it up and made it one big exhibit, and then put our snow leopards in it. And this exhibit works great for our snow leopards. They live in the mountains of Asia, so they like altitude, they like climbing. The rock work provides a lot of climbing for them. As you can see, they like to rest up high where they can kind of see out over the area. Modern zoos reflect that kind of compassion that we should have for animals, and our exhibitry reflects that. I think back in the 30s, they were more interested in just having a collection or a menagerie of animals for people to see, things that people in Kansas weren't used to seeing, like tigers and lions, chimpanzees, things like that. And so I think that the emphasis was on just building an exhibit that would hold them and not worry so much about what the animals' needs were, but more about what the public needs were as far as seeing the animals. The old construction obviously is amazing. It's excellent quality. The stonework you see here is over 70 years old. It's in excellent shape. We do very little as far as maintaining it. We have very little deterioration going on with it. They just were excellent craftsmen. And so the actual stonework that we still use to this day is in excellent shape. It's amazing. As we go through the old WPA exhibits and renovate them and bring them up to modern standards, one of our personal goals is to try to maintain as much of the WPA stonework as we can. And so we've been, I think, fairly successful in doing that. They really kind of designed and built the exhibits, I think, with some flexibility in them, which was really nice. They weren't so specific to a species, for example, that they couldn't be used for anything else. And so we've been able to, as we renovate exhibits, change completely the type of animals that are housed in them. And they've worked really well for that. And as I said, the stonework is amazing. If you can see how big some of these stones are in these walls. And as far as I know, they did it all by hand, or mostly by hand. I'm sure they didn't have, the kind of equipment we have today to lift and haul big, heavy stones around.
WPA built a number of small monkey islands in zoos across the United States. Found at the Ralph Mitchell Zoo in Riverside Park in Independence, Kansas, this exhibit became the birthplace for Miss Able, the first American monkey rocketed into space.
In 1936, the city started a program that they knew that the WPA were doing different buildings throughout the country, and so they were able to get that approved. I came here just on the east side of the stadium. Here was a small set of bleachers that they had a knothole gang, and for a quarter you got a pin said knothole gang, and you get to see all the ball games for the entire season. So I was a member of that group, and that would have probably been in about 1939 or 40. In 1940 I was 12 years old, and at that time I was moving around the community on my bicycle, so I was able to come to the ball games, because I lived clear in the south end of town. It was probably 2 miles from here, so I think that there's been good use. The participation as far as fans is not what we would like to see it, but we talk about it from time to time, that it's too easy for people to stay in the air conditioning and watch TV, and instead of getting out and enjoying the outside and the fellowship of the crowd. You know, the crowd, that's a lot of baseball, is the crowd. I can't watch it on TV, but when there's a crowd, it's interesting.
I came here when I was probably 6 years old with my grandparents. My grandmother was a baseball fan. She didn't drive, and they lived in the county, and my grandfather always had to bring her, and so I got to come. At the time it was built, they said it would seat 1,400, and the thing I remember, we always sat here at the right field's end. The stands were pretty full, and people came more dressed up than we do now. We're more casual now. And as I understand it, the WPA furnished the labor, but the city had to pay for the material. And it ended up costing $53,074.73. And they could see they didn't have that much money, and so there was a drive to sell 3,000 sacks of cement at 75 cents a sack, and they raised that money. That was the whole community that had a part in that. So I think the community was behind it, although the times were hard then. And that's why the WPA was started, to give workmen some work, and the government paid their wages. I think the stadium itself, other than the press box being moved, is pretty much the same as it was at the beginning. And it's 73 years old, and it doesn't show its age at all. I don't think a lot of people realize the significance, and if they haven't had someone play ball here, I think a whole lot of the community really doesn't realize what's here. I think it was built very well. You don't see any cracks in those walls. I'm always amazed as you drive around the country and know something was a WPA project. It's excellent, still in excellent condition. Those guys knew what they were doing.
Businesses failing, high unemployment, Desperate times. Government provides relief. These headlines can be found today as well as during the Great Depression of the 1930s. Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal produced the Works Progress Administration and gave the country a renewed spirit. Work Pays America takes a look at some of the accomplishments and legacy of the WPA.
Production of this program is being funded in part by Insurance Planning of Hayes, Great Bend, and Russell, and its AgPro Crop Insurance and IPI Financial Services Division. For 40 years, Insurance Planning has provided business and personal insurance products for the way you work and live. Principal funding for this program is provided by the Kansas Humanities Council, a nonprofit cultural organization promoting understanding of the history, traditions, and ideas that shape our lives and build community.
The WPA lasted 8 years and employed 8.5 million men and women. Although controversial, this relief program transformed America's landscape through numerous construction and building projects, contributions to culture throughout the arts and education, and forever changed the government's role in the lives of its citizens.
In the early part of the 30s, you had these low commodity prices that just killed the rural economy. And then by the mid-30s, you had drought and Dust Bowl effects that were just exacerbating problems. You had this combination of the urban unemployed who had traditionally worked in, maybe not in industry, but in jobs that were non-agricultural, as well as the agricultural economy that was in dire shape. And so it was a perfect storm of bad economic times.
Times were pretty tense and tight and disagreeable. The heat was extreme, especially in the western part of the state. More the land went away, the less farming occurred. Oil and gas production nearly ceased, and that was a huge revenue maker for the state of Oklahoma for all time. And it was a time of desperate situations.
25% unemployment. I mean, that's the essence of these programs, is there was 25% unemployment. And so, we need to put people to work. And the private sector obviously wasn't able to put them to work. And so the government stepped in, and of course people called it, guess what, socialism. And I guess it was in a way, but it tided us over. Really, it really did tide us over until World War II. It was really the only thing that really got us out of the Depression.
Businesses started going out of business really fast, especially construction firms and manufacturing firms. And when the president, Hoover, was trying to solve the problem, but he just wouldn't give in on his principles. And so when Roosevelt got elected, he says, what we need is to come up with solutions. And so he hired all these really young, bright guys to come up with ideas. And they said, let's put people to work, let's build some buildings. And it just sort of like caught on.
So work relief was the solution that Herbert Hoover advocated, and that was what was advocated and executed through the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And then when Franklin Roosevelt took office, they passed something called the Federal Emergency Relief Act, the FERA. They were still programs that were viewed as very temporary. That this was an emergency. We didn't need to necessarily set up something that was going to be an ongoing kind of program. This depression was big. It was something that required some more fundamental changes in the way government provided relief to its citizens, and something a little more permanent. And one manifestation of that was the Social Security Act, something that we continue to have today. Another aspect of it, not nearly so permanent as the Social Security Act, but another element in this mid-New Deal kind of change of direction was the WPA. So the WPA, which was originally called the Works Progress Administration and later the Works Projects Administration, was put into place in mid-1935, and it replaced the FERA. It replaced the Federal Emergency Relief Act, or the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. In Kansas, the KERC was phased out over a couple of years, and the WPA became the primary work relief organization throughout the country and in Kansas. The WPA was different in the sense that it kind of changed the nature of the relationship between state and local government and the federal government. And that's really one of the keys to this entire time period, is that you had a much more assertive, a much larger federal presence in the lives of everyday Americans.
And I read somewhere where somebody said that what happened during the New Deal era, it salvaged humanity. And I think that that's a really good way of looking at it, because humanity across the nation needed saving. Roosevelt came up with some really good ideas to not put people on the dole, but to give them something to do to earn the money.
So every county in this country has WPA projects in it. And it put people to work a lot. I mean, they did everything. You know, they solved drainage problems, they built dams, they just built whatever buildings were needed. They'd go to every community and say, do you have some public buildings you need? And they said, well, we need a courthouse or we need a civic auditorium, and then they'd sort of make a deal and decide where it would go, and it just grew like topsy. And then they had so many cleanup jobs and stuff like that, and younger people needed work, so they organized the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and they'd fix up parks and build roads, and they were younger and unmarried. And then they had a younger group, were teenagers probably, mostly, and it was the NYA, the National Youth Association. It expanded in the age groups, and they would send guys to school who wanted to learn to do their job better, you know, masonry school, building schools, all kinds of metal schools, and so it just turned into a big training program.
They were labor-intensive projects. They did not rely a lot upon machines and equipment. They wanted labor. They wanted to use people. So to build this shelter house didn't require a lot of heavy equipment. Not that they had much, but if they wanted to use people. So the more people they could use and hire, the better they were off. So there was that emphasis on manual labor to building things like bridges and shelter houses and courthouses and all those things.
And they used local materials wherever they could. They used a lot of wood in the parks, shelter houses, things like that. They'd use the stone they could find, and we had really good limestone in Ellis County that they used. And so they used the best mortar they could find too. They didn't try to save money on stuff the cheap way. They did it the good way, the plain way. And the buildings are all just sort of like really regular buildings without any fanciness on them. And they built to high specifications, and the mortar was great, so the buildings are still up. And there's very little aging on them. So you can recognize it because it was sort of like a mantra of let's build good, strong, sturdy buildings that'll last a long time and use a lot of manpower. And so the WPA buildings have a tendency to look similar because of that.
The Paradise Water Tower in Russell County, Kansas was built in 1938 for a waterworks system. Standing 35 feet high and 17 feet in diameter, the tower has a capacity of 58,000 gallons. The project employed 35 men who earned between 25 and 50 cents an hour and completed the project in about 4 months.
We are in a WPA quarry. We're about 10 miles south of Hayes. The highway's right next to us here. Beautiful little town of Shainton's right over this little hill. And as you can see in the background, this is where the stone crops out. Now the fence post stone is only about 8 or 9 inches thick. So it was real convenient to work with. You could just drill holes in it, put wedges in and break it off. And this quarry just goes right down along the edge of this hill here, up there, I don't know, maybe half a mile. So you got a lot of stone out here, but all this bluff here is full of quarries. It goes clear on up by Pfeiffer and over this way is Rock Haven. And so it was so convenient to use. And it was such a good stone that they'd quarry it here and take it up to Hayes, and used it extensively. When the demand, especially in the Depression where the WPA came out here, well, it turned out to be a nice cash crop. You'd sell the stone that was on your land.
The WPA that I was most familiar with was they had rock quarries on our place, and a crusher after the rock were quarried, and then they were spread on the rural roads in Shawnee County around Topeka. And then across just the road from us, just about 100 yards, was where Lake Shawnee was built. And it was built about the same time, only they had a lot more big equipment there, and not as many WPA workers as what we had on our farm. We probably had 50 or 60 that were working on the rock quarry, but about 15 or 20 were working on the dam there to build Lake Shawnee. And my sister and I, we used to take punch board candy where they could punch to see whether they paid a penny or 2 cents or a nickel for a candy bar. And then we would go at noon hour and sell pints of milk for a nickel apiece, and egg sandwiches for a dime. And it was quite a cross section of men. I remember seeing mostly men maybe 30 to 40 years old, not many that were 50 and older. And they got to work 3 days a week. There were 2 different shifts. Every once in a while they'd have a double shift, and that made it good for our selling our pints of milk and our egg sandwiches when they had double shifts. One crew worked Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and then Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. Some of the people would buy a candy bar about every day, whereas some of them would hardly ever buy. But we soon got to know the ones that were good customers, and they were always very friendly to us. I remember that part of it. And that I think most all of them had kids of their own at home that were of that age where they would be raising their families. Most of them were very conscientious about doing a day's work, because they were just happy to have the $3 to feed the family. And I suppose the foreman could have fired them or told them, you know, you don't need to come back. I don't recall why that happened to anybody, but I felt like that the guys that were getting on us for coming around when they were blasting rock and everything, they were authority people. And they had the power to tell them that they couldn't come. And where we're sitting here, where we can see football stadiums and different things that were built by the WPA project, I thought it was always kind of interesting that they could take on building something, and maybe that those workers had special training along that line, and yet they could really get in there and build a nice football stadium or band shell or something like that, and really do a good job, and really tried to do a good job.
Well, one of the characteristics of WPA projects, many of them, especially recreational projects, there are all kinds of WPA projects, mostly community facilities of various kinds. So they could be stadiums, they could be libraries, community buildings, a few city halls, offices in some cases, garages in some cases, but there were as many as 600 WPA buildings built in Kansas during the period from 1935 to the end of the WPA in 1943. After 1941, when the war began, activity under the WPA program really began to decline, and it was finally ended in 1943. And one of the big categories of structures, over 100, were recreational facilities like swimming pools, parks, playgrounds, and so on. And this was one of the local projects in Kansas. There were state and national WPA projects and lots of local projects. So this is an example of a local project. The construction took about 2 years. The pool opened on July 4th, 1938. So it took about 2 years from the time the drawings were prepared until the pool finally opened. And the newspaper in Holton boasted about how important this was going to be for the town. It would provide jobs. It used local materials, so that was fairly inexpensive, and also provide a community center, an amenity for people to come from miles around, and provided recreation for the youth of the community. And they saw it as a very important facility for them. One of the characteristics of the WPA was to try to build structures that were sympathetic to the natural surroundings and also connected to the past. And that's why this building has the rustic stone style of architecture that it does. It's very simple, but native stone in a rusticated stonework. The idea here was to make use of this site, which is a deep, almost a ravine. And the idea was to place and it was a place where water ran naturally anyway. There were springs in the sides of these hills. So the idea was to make what was a kind of a wasteland a useful site. So they put the swimming pool here, and it is a very beautiful setting for the structure. Over the years, however, the hydrostatic pressure in these hills and underneath the pool began to push up and out and actually cracked the walls of the original concrete swimming pool. So in 1985, the community faced a choice about whether to reuse this structure or not. They passed a bond issue, raised the money, and entirely reconstructed the swimming pool. So what we see here today is a modern reconstructed swimming pool, but it continues to use the filter house, the small building, and the large pool house, or the large bathhouse, which is behind us. The WPA set a direction of using local materials and generally building structures in what was called a rustic style. And this developed from the National Park Service, from buildings that were constructed at national parks.
And when I was a kid, this is where I'd come, because I just walk across town here and go swimming every day. And so I knew it was WPA because it had a plaque right at the door. And I knew that the courthouse was WPA, and the college buildings and the baseball park over here. So I didn't know what all they'd done, but you know, they were pretty big buildings for this little town. I remember on this building we're standing in front of here, the kids used to sit up on the railing and watch the other kids swim, and they'd take pocket knives and scratch their initials between their legs. Scratch away nice. When I thought I'd start trying to carve stone, I says, well, those guys carved their initials in that stone, so at least I'm pretty sure it's carvable. So, you know, just another connection to WPA. It's workable stone. And it turned out it's an exceedingly good stone.
Swimming pools could not even escape controversy. Located within Swope Park in Kansas City, Missouri, is Swope Park Pool. Opening in 1941, the $525,000 pool was the finest in the city. The complex could accommodate 3,000 swimmers at one time, but only admitted white citizens. In June 1951, the pool had barred entrance to 6 African Americans, and the NAACP filed a lawsuit. The swimming pool was closed for 2 years during the court proceedings. Following the court's ruling, the pool reopened on June 12, 1954, allowing admittance without restriction on the basis of race.
Well, the bridges were a big surprise. When I started in '85, I went and talked to Doug Phillip out there in the country, and he says, now don't miss this bridge over here by Fort Fletcher. It's a beautiful stone bridge. So I went out there and saw that it was a 4-arch bridge, big bridge, and I figured, well, there's probably other stone bridges. They don't just build one stone bridge. So I figured the only way I could find out was to drive every county road in Ellis County, which is about 1,700 miles, and it took 6 weeks to drive those things and mark them on the map, make sure I got it, and I found 96 stone bridges in Ellis County. Most of these bridges you don't notice because they don't stick up real high, and you drive across them and you have to get off the road to see them. But with like 100 bridges out there, I mean, that was only in about a 5 or 6 year period too. They were just building like crazy. And all you have to do is slow down and look over the side and see if it's stone or not, and you'll find a WPA bridge. So nobody else built stone bridges around here.
Most of the money that was spent by the WPA went for these large-scale public works construction projects. So that's where most of the money went. But the array of other types of projects that they got involved in are actually pretty astonishing. So they had things like a federal writers project to try and employ those with writing skills, a federal arts project that many people are probably familiar with, where murals were painted in public buildings, federal music project, federal theater project. So it was an effort to expand beyond just unskilled labor, which most WPA workers, that's what they were involved in, is pretty much unskilled labor. There were also these other efforts to try and provide employment to those with special skills. You had projects that taught people how to can their own food, how to sew better, how to make mattresses, and they would actually get large numbers of people together to do these kinds of things. And it's just they tried a little bit of everything. It was a very long and in many ways very successful program. I think it accomplished a lot of the things that it set out to accomplish.
Standing 17 feet tall, the Mennonite settler statue was built in 1942 out of Kansas limestone. Located in Athletic Park in Newton, Kansas, the statue was financed through the local community and a WPA art project.
My parents worked on a project in New York City that the Writers Project wrote the stories and the WPA artists illustrated them. My parents worked on it from 1935 to 1939. That's because we left New York City then. And they were illustrating the children's books for the public schools there. And there was a program trying to upgrade the reading skills of kids, which sounds familiar. My mother told me that she moved down to the Lower East Side so she'd have the right address to get the WPA in 1935. And then she met my father, and one thing led to another, and they had a kid, and me, and they worked on the books. They were given, they go downtown to the office, and they would turn in their previous work, and then they get an assignment, and then they would go home and work on it. The next 2 weeks or a month later, they would turn it in and get another assignment to get their paycheck. My mother told me that they were making, when they left there, they were making, each of them making $91 a month for the WPA. These were books that my parents illustrated. They were sponsored by the by the school board in New York City. My mother did this one here, and obviously it's done on mimeograph. She worked directly on the mimeograph stencil, and my father did this group here. And they have 9 books listed in libraries that my father did, and 3 that my mother did. But I also inquired about why there weren't more, since they worked on this project 4 years. And he said that there's probably some that didn't make it into libraries. But because at the end of the WPA, they just sort of shoveled everything out in the trash. My father never did really talk about it, but my mother told me just little tidbits through the years, you know. And she used to refer to the WPA as the whoopa, because she didn't want anyone to know that they had been on quote-unquote relief, you know. But at least they had a job. They produced a product. They made something useful, which now we value, even though it probably wasn't valued that much then. And I think it's really great that we have all these WPA projects around the area that are still in use. But I think that program was quite worthwhile. I think it was. Let's put it this way: if it wasn't for the WPA, I wouldn't be here.
The WPA is probably better known for the big projects, you know, road and bridge construction, buildings, public works, that type of thing. But they also had divisions that concentrated on the arts and on women's projects. We learned that they did teaching women how to can. They did hot lunch programs in the schools for the first time. They had sewing rooms in nursery schools. And one of the women's projects was the sewing and the handicrafts. So they taught people how to do printmaking, weaving, metalwork, all sorts of things like that, and created artifacts that they felt would be educational and could be used in schools and libraries and museums to teach children in a hands-on way. So that's how this particular part of the WPA came to be. The collection was actually purchased by the library board in 1938 and 1939. They put their order in and had to pay the cost of materials, so they paid maybe about $1 per item for the things, and they could choose what they wanted. For years, the collection was not displayed. It was just in the basement, stored, wrapped up in plastic bags, and the prints had never been framed. The dolls had had some sunlight damage, so we obtained a grant through the Kansas Humanities Council to preserve and properly display the collection so that it could be enjoyed. And in the process, did a lot of research about the WPA and discovered that our community has a lot of WPA projects. So I think the 1930s and the Depression era are coming more to the forefront of people's minds right now. Maybe because of the economic times, or maybe just because enough time has passed that it's beginning to seem interesting. And I was, you know, interested to learn that the women's aspects of the WPA were not very well known at all. So I'm hoping that the research and by bringing some of this forward that there will be more interest in that part of it. You know, just looking at these structures that have been here all these years and are still in excellent condition, that when they built these things, they were built well. And yeah, I think they did a lot of positive things for our community. And now that we're starting to really explore, you know, this heritage of our community, it's given us a real theme and a real thing to promote in our small town. The prints that we have were done by Margaret Whittemore, and she went around the state and designed prints of Kansas landmarks. So a lot of them are what she considered to be historical sites of the time, and some of them I think are no longer standing, so it really did achieve the objective of preserving a part of the state's history. And she also did some of Kansas birds and that sort of thing as well. The dolls are costume dolls. They were designed to show different eras of costume in foreign countries as well as throughout American history. And we also have the wooden models and paintings that were done as part of this project. It was part of Roosevelt's philosophy overall that it wasn't enough to just put people to work, but he wanted to really preserve American culture and get that out to the masses. And so this was just kind of following that in providing things that were educational and artistic to local communities and especially to children. And there's a big front page article in our local paper when the things first arrived, how all the school children came and people came in, you know, masses of people. I think they said 500 people came to view this. It was a big deal at the time. The people who lived through that time are getting elderly now, so it's really the time when we need to record and document that part of our nation's history.
Often mistaken for WPA art, post office murals and other artwork were commissioned by the Treasury Department and completed by artists who had competed for the opportunity to create art for newly constructed federal buildings. The subject matter was almost always based on local history of the community, and the artwork became accessible to the public. The town of Nicodemus, Kansas struggled during the 1930s, but the community spirit rose with the construction of the Township Hall in 1939. 12 local men worked on the stone quarried near Webster Reservoir and was a 2-year project. The building now houses the Nicodemus National Historic Site operated by the National Park Service.
My dad had a business, and he didn't like the idea of the WPA because he thought it was like a dole. It was sort of like free lunch. You didn't have to earn your living like his guys did. And so there was an onus on it that was thought it was like second grade work or something like that, and not really the thing to do, but it worked. I mean, you know, it puts so many people to work. We were having a drought, we were having a depression, and so many people out of work. And this not only put people to work, but it trained them how to build things and how to use their hands, and that just kept getting handed down. And nowadays, you can really look on the WPA and see how successful it was. It was everywhere and into all kinds of hidden things you wouldn't even think about. And it had a great influence.
Many towns didn't have a community building, or they didn't have a real city hall before the 1930s when the WPA provided that. So there was a very significant investment in community facilities that was accomplished by the WPA. I think also the other important thing is that it kept people's morale up in difficult times. It also provided them a sense that they could do something about these mysterious forces that were causing them so much difficulty. The economic problems, the fact that businesses were closing and banks were closing. And we shouldn't forget that the 1930s is a period of drought in Kansas as well. So agriculture was hit very hard in the 1930s. So we can look at what went on in the 1930s and see Kansans and Americans working very hard to come up with solutions to very difficult problems. And they did a very good job at that, and the WPA is one of those examples. People wanted to work. They were willing to work at manual labor building this pool, and they were glad to have those jobs in those times and glad to be part of building something for their community. And I think that's a good lesson for us.
It's ancient history, of course, to most people, most Americans now, but it is part of our past, not too distant past, part of our past. So if there are parts of it that we can say, yeah, that was done way back, we did this. And why did we do this? Well, we did it because we had this problem, a significant problem the country faced. So maybe those murals, those posters, those paintings, those buildings, those bridges should be preserved as a history lesson, I guess, that way.
Yeah, I'm fully committed to the kind of the historic preservation ethic, but they're tremendous structures. And you know, one of the things about WPA structures is that there was an emphasis on a lot of handwork, you know, a lot of manual labor to employ more people, on fine craftsmanship, on using local materials. I mean, they're outstanding structures, and we should, I think, in my view, I think we should preserve as many of them as we can and maintain their integrity as much as we can. You know, I think more importantly, as I indicated earlier, the 1930s, the WPA, and all of the other programs, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, all of the different things that got federal government involved in the economy and in the lives of individuals, I mean, it was a watershed event in the role of the federal government in American life generally. And so, and it's never been, it hasn't changed in a really significant way since then. That was the time when of true kind of expansion of that federal role, for good or for ill.
People probably didn't, who are critics of the WPA, probably didn't see the result of the 1,000 schools built in Oklahoma. That the legacy that the WPA gave the school children of Oklahoma or of New Jersey or of Kansas or of Texas. And I'm sure that there were people who did not work and did not work well and preferred to spend time underneath a shade tree rather than trying to build a wall of a bathhouse at a swimming pool in Altus, Oklahoma. But there were still those that got the job done. And as the WPA continued, work improved. Men took more of a pride in their work. They became more expert. And you know there are going to be those who piddle around out of 119,000 people. I still think that the majority of workers took it seriously and knew that they were contributing something. And if nothing else, the WPA shows that there is a cooperation between state government and federal government that perhaps we have lost contact with here in the early 21st century.
I was just thinking, boy, I don't know if people know how to use shovels much anymore or hammers. You'd have a hard time having a WPA. They'd all have to be young people because, of course, young people like electronic things, and the WPA had nothing electronic or hardly anything mechanical. So the mindset is really different, and I don't know how well that'd work anymore. But they didn't know how to work in a WPA, and it worked fine. So who knows? It was to put people to work. That was what was important. Give them some money.
The WPA gave America a chance to work with thousands and thousands and thousands of people out of work. The way you instill self-confidence and self-worth in a person is to give him or her something to do and then reward that accomplishment. And I think perhaps that mode of thought stayed throughout maybe the 60s or the 70s, but now that the WPA years are 75 years away, 80 years away, I think maybe that we've gotten out of the notion of working is good, working is contributing. Now it seems like the dole situation is more in style or more expected. Give me something because I am here. I can see that in students' grades. I did the work. Why didn't I get an A? I didn't do it right. We piddle around. I'm an historian, and I love history, and we need to retain those images, those people, those things, those buildings, those musical scores that make us who we are. We cannot forget our past. And I think that as much as humanly possible, WPA project buildings and cemetery fences and bathhouses at a swimming pool somewhere need to be maintained or at least identified as this is something that helped make America cohesive. This is something that was done out of difficult circumstances. Strange, different, unique, unfamiliar people came together to build something for the good of all of society. I don't think you can have that done today, and that to me is a landmark event where there's cooperation, where there is something successful and something that actually came about as a result of communal effort. I think that's pretty special.
Production of this program is being funded in part by Insurance Planning of Hayes, Great Bend, and Russell, and its AgPro Crop Insurance and IPI Financial Services Division. For 40 years, Insurance Planning has provided business and personal insurance products for the way you work and live.